Hello, I'm Pastor Nanette Christofferson, and along with Pastor Steve Talmage, we offer these short Bible studies on our lectionary readings. This week we find ourselves in Pentecost 17, and we are in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, 1 through 16. What we have before us this day is a very famous parable that often leaves one questioning about the ultimate meaning of it. But before we get to this parable, let's back up just a little bit to Matthew chapter 19. And both chapters 19 and 20, they begin with what is called a formula that signifies the end of one of Matthew's 5 sections. We know this because it's written in other areas in the Gospel of Matthew. It says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, we see this in chapter 7 and in 11, in 13, and in 26. So we now learn that Jesus' Galilean ministry is finished. And that is where he has spent his entire ministry in the Gospel of Matthew. And he's heading towards his destiny in Jerusalem. Jensen, in his book, Preaching Matthew's Gospel, writes this. In chapters 19 and 20, Jesus begins to address his disciples about the nature of following him and how differently the children of the kingdom live from the normal cultural expectations of the day. These chapters cover such topics as marriage, divorce, celibacy, children, rank, privilege, and money. Chapters 19 and 20 certainly set forth the nature of the life of Christian discipleship. So let's turn to the parable of the laborers and the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out, and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Let's think about this. What is this parable about? No, seriously, I wish you were right here in my office so I could hear what your ideas are. Go back and reread the parable, I challenge you. And then write down, the parable of the laborers and the vineyards is it about God's righteousness? Is it about fairness, envy, equality, a new kind of government, the first and the last? What is this parable trying to tell us? And what do you hear, and how do you hear it this time, perhaps maybe a little bit differently than you've heard it in times before? If you are anything like me, you would find that we could reread this parable a couple of times and come up with a slightly different angle on it, depending on the word or phrase you use to summarize the story. This does not mean, of course, that the parable can mean anything, but that there is some complexity to the way the biblical text, and perhaps parables in particular, will strike us. Carl Jacobson writes in his commentary of 2014, he says, "The parable of the laborers in the vineyard is about the 9th and 10th commandment. In a very real sense, this parable is about coveting. Covet fits both the emphasis of Jesus' teaching and the overarching emphasis in Matthew on the law and Jesus' representation of it in a way that transforms our thinking and doing. We covet what God chooses to give to others. We are invited to see ourselves in the story and then apply it to ourselves. The wages at stake, even at the moment of Jesus' first telling of the parable, are not actually daily wages for vineyard laborers, but forgiveness, life, and salvation for believers. We need not literally be laborers in a vineyard, as we are all of us co-workers in the kingdom. Coveting. In relationship, one believer to another, covetousness is a problem. The point here isn't necessarily that other folks receive blessings from God that we don't, that they get more or better or lovelier gifts from God. The problem is that they get the same as us, and they don't deserve it, do they? They are less worthy, or later arrivals, or just plain worse sinners. They don't deserve the same as we get, do they? The parable's day laborers parallel perfectly with today's forgiven sinners in both our pews and pulpits. Are we ever frustrated by God's grace for others? I think perhaps we can be. We have a tendency, as the parable aptly illustrates, to covet and to be resentful of what others receive from God. The owner of the vineyard asks those who have worked longest and presumably hardest for him, "Am I not allowed to do what I choose, what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" The point is that God's grace, mercy, and forgiveness are God's to give away as God sees fit. Could the parable of the laborers in the vineyard be about coveting, about our frustration with the grace of God as it applies not to us, but to others? Could this parable be about the first and the last? Second, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard is about the first and the last. The parable itself displays a reversal of expectations. The last will be first, and the first will be last. This is not only a summary of the parable, but a critical aspect of New Testament theology. Notice the flow of the narrative as the workers are compensated for their laborers. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. When the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But perhaps the phrase, "you have made them equal to us," is the phrase that might catch our eye and make all of us cringe, especially when we consider what our American work ethic and capitalism is all about. The last are literally first in that they are paid first, and the first who have labored longest must also wait the longest to get theirs. But notice as well that the first who are now last do not receive nothing or less. They receive the same. As the laborers themselves say, "You have made them equal to us." So perhaps it should be said that the last shall be first, and the first shall be the same. This is all about the reversal of expectation, and that oftentimes summarizes Jesus' teachings. This element of the parable is taken up in other Gospels and in Revelation. The scandalous reversal of expectation, of our sense of justice, and even our hopes, is a central piece of the New Testament. Whoever wants to be first must be last, and servant of all. So much for human ideas of greatness. Who is worthy to climb the holy hill and enter the gate of God's kingdom? Some are last who will be first, and some are first who will be last. And it is Jesus who is first and last, who tells us that we need not fear, for in the one who is both first and last, the first and the last are brought together, when we are called to lay down the burdens of our days and find our home with God. But here's the scandal, right? The scandal of this parable is that we are all equal recipients of God's gifts. The scandal of our faith is that we are often covetous and jealous when God's gifts of forgiveness and life are given to others in equal measure, and especially are given to others whom we don't think deserve it. So let's take a look at some questions. Is there anything that is unsettling about this parable? If so, why, or what is it? Do you see this parable played out today? If so, how? I don't know how often I see it actually played out with a generous landowner paying everyone the same. But I do see it played out with the need of daily laborers who are working for daily wages. On the west side, when I lived down there, there was a corner where people would stand on Saturday mornings, actually Monday through Saturday, you'd see them standing there. And they would stand hoping that a truck would come by and pick them up and take them and give them work to do that day. I think there are ways in which this parable is still played out. What does this parable tell you about the heart of God? I think this parable tells us how God sees everyone as equal. And what does this parable reveal to you about your own heart? And I think that question really, Jesus, by telling this parable, when we find ourselves upset at this parable, or thinking things are unfair, or coveting God's grace because God offered grace to someone else, just like Jonah in Nineveh, I think that reveals a lot about our heart. And it can be troubling because God's ways, again, are scandalous, are reversals, are very different than our ways. I pray each and every day that all of us as Christians can begin to see, including myself, the ways of God, how God sees the world, how God loves others unconditionally, and offers his mercy and grace and justice to all. May you have a blessed week, and may God reveal to you what you need to see this week.